There he goes. Okay, so quick introduction to the course. This is Islamic Intellectual History, 1400 years of theology, philosophy, and religious thought. Quick information about myself. Already need to make a correction, so it's Javad. I know I spell it funny, but it is Javad with a V and an A, not Javed. I get it all the time, so I'm used to it. Quick introduction about myself. So I did train as a physician, and I am a practicing physician, but I went back to do fellowship in medical ethics, focusing on Islamic bioethics. I kind of went down the rabbit hole and decided, you know what, I need to do the whole thing and get a bachelor's and master's in Islamic studies, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in Islamic studies at Harvard University. So that's where I am right now. This is my contact. Please note that it's an underscore, Javad underscore Hashmi at mail.harvard.edu. I do encourage feedback, please. This is a learning process. This is the first time I've taught this course. I think this is the first time we've done such a large group of people as well. So we're going to learn together, and we can make changes as we go. So I really do encourage you to give your feedback. And it helps with me to make sure that I'm not giving this talk in a vacuum. So whether it's positive, negative, or something to improve, please do let me know. So requirements of the course, the good news, there's no reading homework. I will point you to optional readings. Those are things that we went over in class. So you don't need to necessarily read that material during that week, but it's just something for you to note down, put on your bookshelf kind of thing. Now the downside, these are long, involved lectures, and we do have to be cognizant of Zoom fatigue. It's already hard enough to listen for such a long time in a classroom. It's even harder with Zoom. So what I'm doing, initially I was planning on giving 0 homework. I'm gonna give homework as a video, videos that I'm gonna record. I'm gonna put these up on my YouTube, and you should listen to these on your off days. You can listen to them at 1.5 or 2 times speed when you're working out, when you're brushing your teeth, just over the course of the day. I find that to be easier than to listen to someone lecturing for 2 hours. If we do it this way, then I don't have to lecture that much in class. I can just talk a little bit, and then we can go to some discussion or questions. Again, this is a learning experience. We may decide to change this as we go, but this is what I decided so far. And of course, even these video lectures are not mandatory. There's no grade in the class. So that's up to you whether you do that or not. In addition to that, we're going to have optional deep dives. These are videos as well, but these are more of the optional variety. And that's my YouTube right there that you can subscribe to for that. These are basically, I'm going a little bit more in depth. I don't expect most students to want to listen to them, but for those who really want to go down the rabbit hole, those are going to be up as well. On that note, I would consider this an upper division undergraduate or introductory graduate course. So if you find this course challenging, you're probably not the only one. You have 2 options. One, you can kind of use this lecture today as kind of a shopping week, decide if this class is for you or not. We'll see how many people stick around. I might bore people to death, so who knows how many people will show up next week. But even if you get 30% of the information, that's actually a good first pass. And that's how I would take it as, so don't get discouraged. Now, if you are an advanced master's level or PhD level student, or you have a lot of traditional Islamic learning, maybe this class is too basic for you. You're still welcome to take the class and give your feedback, and you might learn a thing or two. There's always good to get different perspectives. The other thing I wanted to mention is I do commit one grave faux pas, which is I have lots of texts on slides, which is a PowerPoint or Zoom faux pas. But the reason why I do that is because I know that these are going to go up on videos, and I want you to be able to pause and read the entire quote if you wanted to. That's kind of like a proof text, you can say. But really, when you're listening to me, all you got to do is focus on the read. So don't get discouraged by how much text there is on the slide. Just focus on the read. Some quick netiquette and rules. So again, Zoom, please use video if you feel comfortable with that. Please mute yourself unless talking due to the background noise. For questions, please use the raise hand function and send questions to the moderator. We'll try to stop every so often. Now the moderator is going to be Sarah Dean. That's S-A-R-A. Last name is Dean, D-E-E-N. Please send the questions. I'm having some problems looking at the screen right now, so I may have to stop every few slides and ask the moderator if we have any questions. I do want some people to be able to ask questions with the video. Again, that makes it more interactive so that we're talking to each other in a classroom setting. We do have to balance between interactiveness and need to cover a lot of material, so we'll do the best that we can. And kind of we're offloading some of this by doing those YouTube videos that you watch at home, and then hopefully we can dedicate more to discussion here. Okay, another rule, please speak in English, translate any Arabic, Urdu, Persian, Dothraki, any foreign languages, please do make sure to translate because we want to be courteous to everybody and speak in English so everyone can understand. The other thing is, this is kind of in red. Please be charitable, respectful, and collegial. You're welcome to have differences of opinion. We encourage that. You're welcome to push back against everything I say. That's perfectly fine. But even when we talk about, and this is in our Islamic tradition, is to be charitable to your opponent. You'll often see, for example, Imam Ghazali, when he was debating with the Islamic philosophers, he was very charitable to them in one sense that he accurately represented their side, to such an extent that one of his books, Maqasid al-Falasifa, he did such a good job of representing their side that when the Europeans got this text, they thought Ghazali was one of the Islamic philosophers, meaning they thought he was on the opposite side that he really was. That's how good he did representing their side of the debate. So please be charitable. Think of all of these thinkers and groups as being rational actors. Even when we're discussing somebody like Osama bin Laden, let's at least try to understand why it is that he comes to the views he comes to, even if we disagree 100%. This will help us to at least understand where they're coming from and where our interventions are going to be. And I think the best example of this is Ghamidi Saab himself. When you see him debating someone, actually, if you look at him when he talks about Ahmadis, he does such a good job of representing them that he's been accused of being Ahmadi himself. I think that's probably a good representation of the fact that you're doing a good job, is the fact that people think, hey, is this guy of that side or not? That's how good you want to be on this aspect. So you are welcome to push back, but please be respectful and collegial. Recordings will be available for viewing. So if you ask a question or your video is there, you should be cognizant of that. And we will, of course, have a small break halfway through the lecture. I know it's a long time, 2 hours. We're learning, it's a learning process. We'll see if we want to tweak this going forward. And again, send me that feedback at my email. All right, a quick disclaimer. I am not affiliated with Ghamidi Center or Al-Mawrid in any capacity. I do, however, consider myself a sympathetic friend in the academy. I have a deep and abiding respect and admiration for Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. He's risked his life for this project of Islamic reform, and he is a light in the Islamic world, in my opinion. But I do want to say that the views expressed here are my own and do not express the views or opinions of the Ghamidi Center or Al-Mawrid. I do this for two reasons. One is to protect the Ghamidi Center. I don't want to say something and that not be representative of Mr. Ghamidi or the Mawrid team in general. And I also want to make it clear that I may not agree with everything. So we want to, and that I think is consistent with Ghamidi Saab's viewpoint himself. He doesn't want somebody to be just a blind follower of anyone. I'm not affiliated with any other organizations. I'm only a seeker of knowledge. I am a PhD student. I'm not a professor and I'm not a sheikh. So I may not be the best of you. You may have more knowledge than me on many different topics. What I'm doing here today in this class is I'm just sharing my journey, my intellectual journey. The figures and thinkers that I've seen in Islamic history that I wasn't familiar with before and that I think many of us should be familiar with. That's all I'm doing in this course. And unfortunately, I have no financial disclosures to disclose. If you want to give me some finances, I'm more than happy with that, but unfortunately, I don't. The goals of the course, now you may have already seen this in the YouTube promo, so I'm just going to be quick about this. The point is to help us appreciate the rich diversity of Islamic thoughts so that we can better contextualize current debates that are going on. And because it is only a 1-month course, we can only begin that journey. And I'm still going through that journey myself. So, but hopefully this will give you the tools necessary to begin that quest. Now I do that because I think we are being gaslit. Now, what does gaslighting mean? I actually just learned this term in the last year. It basically means when, it's a slang term, of course. It means when your events or situations have been manipulated in order to make a person believe that he or she is crazy. Why do I say this? I think we are being gaslit in regard to our Islamic tradition, so that certain ideas are considered crazy and without any precedent whatsoever. So you often see that Mr. Ghamidi will be accused of, you are the only person in the entire Islamic Ummah who ever said X, Y, or Z. Well, when you actually study Islamic history, you see that actually we had quite a vast tradition in which all different sides were represented. And we unfortunately don't have that variety of thought today. We kind of have a more monolithic and closed-minded, myopic viewpoint today. Now, I did want to ask a question before I go any further. Are the slides being hidden by our heads, or can everybody see the slides?
No, they're hidden.
You can see it. Yeah. No, that was better.
Is this better?
Yeah. Previous was better.
Oh, previous was better? Okay, hold on. Okay, so right now, is any of the text being hidden by our heads?
It is hidden.
It is or is not? Sorry.
I mean, we can drop it down.
Okay, let's see.
To minimize the thumbnail view.
Okay, let me see if I can. Can someone do that for me, or?
This is good. This is good.
This is good right here?
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is individual settings you can do at your own end. It will fix it. I think from the host end, I think it's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, each individual person has to touch on it. Yeah.
Okay, but you can see, for example, right now where it says curriculum, nothing is hiding it. Okay, great.
Yeah, full slide is visible.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so here's what the class is going to look like, all 10 classes. I initially had said 8. I'm asking for 2 extra classes just because I realize it's a lot of material. Maybe we can offload some of that with the YouTubes that I'm going to upload. But the other thing is that if you notice in class 1, I decided to focus on the formative period and the Quran instead of jumping into the major sects of Islam. So that's really, I thought it would be kind of criminal not to cover that. And then also I have a extra class just because I think we're going to probably fall behind. It's just a natural course of things that, so this is just a tentative course outline. We can tweak this as we go. But it's usually every Wednesday and Friday. No class on May 1st. That's because I will be working in the ER on that day. And I got this YouTube comment under my promo video. I thought it was kind of comical, but fortunately I had already dedicated class 1 to the Quran. But again, if you look at this kind of comment that somebody is writing, is this being charitable? Is this being respectful? Is this doing the husn al-dhan that's part of our tradition? No, it's not. So what I'm asking everyone to do is, think the best of whoever you're in discussion with. All right. Now, before I begin any lecture, I always like to start with what are called the principles of religious literacy. These are what dictate how I teach my courses. The first principle of religious literacy, and these principles, by the way, they were first written down by Diane Moore of Harvard Divinity School, and they're now accepted by the American Academy of Religion. The first point is that religions are not monolithic in nature, but rather are characterized by a great deal of internal diversity. That's the entire purpose of this course, is to show you this diversity of thought. And this diversity of thought, by the way, is not just, it's not just Sunni, Shia, Hanafi, Maliki, Hanbali. No, there's actually a greater diversity than that. The second point of religious literacy is that religions are not ahistorical or static, but rather they evolve and change over time. We kind of have this idea where we back project everything onto the early Islam and then think things just stayed that way the entire time. And this is part of what I call the saved sect mentality. Really, as an academic studying religion, this is something that I can no longer take very seriously. And I think it really puts blinders on us if we think this way. The third point of religious literacy is that religion is intimately and inexorably tied to culture, context, and all aspects of life. So I often hear many Muslims say this, and I understand why they're saying it. But I often hear that, oh, this is not religion, this is culture. Well, different religious expressions take place in different cultural contexts, and no religious claim exists in a vacuum. Even the claim that this is culture and not religion takes place in a certain culture and context. So let's, instead of ignoring culture and context, let's understand it and understand how that influences religious expression. The fourth point is that there is a difference between the devotional expression of particular religious beliefs as normative and the non-sectarian study of religion that presumes the religious legitimacy of diverse normative claims. Okay, that's a handful. Basically what I'm saying here is, you can say that Islam says X, Y, and Z, and really believe that. That is your right as a Muslim to have that viewpoint. That's a devotional claim. But when we're trying to study this topic as kind of from an academic perspective, we have to kind of accept that there are going to be diverse claims. So one person might say the beard is part of Islam, that you must have a beard, but that's not in line with many different viewpoints. So we need to, and by the way, I hope that maybe in post somebody can edit in a beard for me so that we don't get that question. But all right, the fifth point is that all knowledge claims are situated in that they arise out of particular social historical contexts and therefore represent particular rather than universally applicable claims. That kind of goes with the third point. Basically, everyone is coming from a certain background. What even me, when I teach this course to you, it's my background, where I grew up, what I believed as a child, what I learned in my particular schooling. These all will come to bear. So the point is, take everything with a grain of salt, even the things that I say. And on that note, on that point, I want to say, be cautious of claims when you hear Islam says. Islam is not a person. Islam does not take a shower. Islam eats nothing. Islam says nothing. Muslims do. Keep that in mind. And that's a quote from Professor Omid Safi, but we also have that in our own tradition. So when the fourth caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib, when a group called the Kharijites, and we'll talk about them, when they were saying, let the Quran decide for us on this matter, what did Ali respond back? He said, yes, we have made the Quran the authority, but this Quran is merely a scripture placed between two covers. It, the Quran, does not speak. It is merely men who speak through it. This is a little bit of epistemic humbleness here, where we're recognizing the human elements. And this is something that I want us to appreciate in this course. Okay, some key terms real quick. Heresy, it's a hard word to say, heresiography, and I probably mispronounced it. And hagiography. These are two big words, but all there are basically two things that I want to avoid in this course. I'm not going to teach all of these groups and sects as if they're heresies, right? This is how traditionally Islamic, in an Islamic madrasa, that's how they would teach the different sects. They would say, these are the different deviant groups, and this is what's wrong with them. The reason why it's not helpful to do that is that inevitably it means that you're probably going to misrepresent their views. You're not going to give their best case arguments or help you understand why they believe what they do. On the flip side, we're going to stay away from hagiography, again, a tough word to say, basically, which is where you kind of, we do this when we talk about our past scholars. We say, oh, they were superhuman in memory. They memorized millions of hadith. They didn't sleep for the whole night. They only, this is kind of, when you do this, then you kind of take away that human element. And I think then you don't get the accurate assessment of that person or that group. The other point is, we're going to keep in mind that all religions begin as cults, even Islam. Remember, when the Prophet started preaching, what did the Quraysh, the pagans, what did they come out? They said, why are you teaching this deviant group, this deviant ideology? Let's keep that in mind. So let's not talk about what's a cult, what's a sect. Let's just try to understand diverse expressions of faith. And keep in mind that one man's heterodoxy is another man's orthodoxy. That's why I put orthodoxy, which means proper belief, in quotes. So what I believe proper Islam is may not be what you believe proper Islam is or what the third person believes. Again, I'm just asking for some humbleness here. And on that point, I wanted to show this video. Let's see if I can find it now. All right. Can everybody see the video? I'm going to play right now. Okay.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Let's see if it'll play for me. Okay, so that video was made by Harvard Divinity School's Religious Literacy Project. But the point of that video, as you can tell, is that Muslims are a diverse group of people that come from all walks of life. And in this class, the diversity that we're going to be exploring is the intellectual diversity of Islamic thoughts. Any questions? This is a good time to ask questions. Let's see if I can see how to call on people. So from the Ghamidi Center team, is there a way that I can know who's asking questions?
You can click on the participants
Okay.
icon that
Okay.
you will see the.
Okay. So that was kind of our admin.
And then if you can click on chat, you can also look
Okay.
at what people are saying.
And chat is, let's see what chat is. I'm not seeing clearly where the chat is. Okay.
Chat is on the bottom. It's currently we don't have any question.
Okay, I see Uzma has a question. So I'm going to ask her. So I'll unmute her. Uzma, can you ask your question kindly? Sorry, Uzma, are you unmute? Can you ask your question?
She said in a chat message that she doesn't have a question.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'll lower her hand. Okay, because that was the raise hand function. And everybody should see the raise hand function. That's how you can ask a question. Or at least notify me that you have a question. And we'll tweak this as, okay, I see the chat box now. Okay. All right, she says she did have a question. Okay. So let me ask, let me unmute her again. Or you're not muted, Uzma. Can you ask your question? And everyone else, please mute yourself kindly.
She says in the last message she doesn't have a question.
Oh, it says I did have it says right here, to me privately, she says, my question is, will we have access to the slides? I have to decide about that. I might do that or I might not do that. The slides will be available on the YouTube. Maybe I will upload them. Let me think on that. I know someone else has asked that question too. There's certain reason why I would want to keep them private, but I'll definitely think about that. But you can definitely see the video and pause. But maybe I'll make them available. All right. So that's the introduction. So I'm going to close this and we'll start with our talk. All right. I'm gonna lower this, and I'll stop shortly for questions again. All right, so we're starting with the formative period of Islam and the Quranic trajectory. This is lecture number 1. Is everybody getting a bubble that says who's talking, or is it coming out fine on their video?
Well, fine with me.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine.
Okay. Okay, great. All right, and now I have the chat box, so I can have access to that, so I appreciate that. Okay, so why did I decide to start this course with the Quran? The Quran is the primary scripture of Islam, but it's also the earliest source that we have. There's a debate in the Quranic studies community, but increasingly the pendulum, and I'm talking about Western scholars, has swung in the direction of saying that the Quran solidified as a text very early on. So that's one of the reasons that we would use this text to understand the earliest moment of Islamic history. In that sense, the Quran can be considered a quasi-historical text. We can also view the Quran as an object of intellectual history. And the reason why we rely on the Quran as this earliest source, well, we have manuscript evidence that's increasingly becoming available. And the other reason is we use what's called the historical critical method. This is the Western historical method, but basically we note that the Quran lacks historical anachronisms. All right, so the Quran doesn't talk about future events when we would think, oh, the Quran is probably written at a later period of time. It had already become a closed text very early on. There's some other sources that we can think about as well. The most obvious of these is the hadith, or the prophetic traditions, the seerah, the prophetic biography, the maghazi, the battle stories, and the asbab al-nuzul, or the occasions of revelation. All of these secondary sources, they're all really made up of the same stuff, so to speak. So I really consider them pretty similar to the hadith from that perspective. The problem with this source from a historical academic perspective is that they are full of historical anachronisms. I'll give you an example. There was this hadith that was, or quote unquote hadith, that was circulating in the time of the Gulf War. The Greeks and Franks will join with Egypt in the desert against a man named Saddam, and not one of them will return. Well, if we saw this narration, could we guess when this report was generated? Well, it's probably not generated before the Gulf War, right? It's not generated in the 1800s. So we can place where we think this hadith came about based on this historical critical method. Now, that hadith, of course, nobody's going to take very seriously, but here are some hadiths that are part of our 6 books of hadith, all of them sahih or graded as hasan by the traditional Islamic scholars. But we have this hadith, for example, the rightly guided caliphate will be for 30 years and there will be a kingship after that. The hadith predict Umar's martyrdom, Uthman's martyrdom, the civil wars under Ali, the conquest of Egypt, the conquest of Constantinople. It even tells who will, says something about who will conquer it. And all of these are, by the way, quoted by a sheikh, a reputable sheikh, by a reputable Muslim organization. Now, I can't discount the idea from a theological perspective that Muslims might believe that the Prophet does have the ability to predict the future, that God may give him this information. But as an academic, this is very difficult for me to take seriously from an academic historical perspective. So I'm trying to balance both of these. I'm approaching this from the academic perspective. So this is my methodology. My methodology, these are Muslim academics who are all basically doing the exact same thing, which is to take the Quran as the primary source and try to read the Quran on its own terms and as a unity within itself. And 2 of the scholars that are very famous for this are Toshihiko Uzitsu and Fazl Rahman, both of whom inform my methodology greatly. There are also non-Muslim Western scholars who take this approach. So Fred Donner is one example. And surprisingly enough is Patricia Crone, who was a major Islamic scholar. A lot of controversy surrounding her. But the point is that this approach is really gaining steam even in the Western Academy. Now, there are certain theological reasons as well to take this approach. And here I would quote Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, that the first thing that we need to use is the Quran itself and try to understand the Quran through the Quran. Mr. Ghamidi also argues for Quranic coherence, that the Quran is not just a disjointed and haphazardly placed text. And he takes the Quran as the final authority. And he interprets the Quran in light of the Quran. And even when he approaches the Hadith, he thinks it should be interpreted in light of the Quran. Now, when we say this, we're always, even Mr. Ghamidi has been accused of this, and I'm sure I will be accused of this. You're accused of, are you being a Quranist, a Quran-only person? Well, here I would quote Professor Lamptey, who's a Muslim academic. She says, and I agree with her, that she's not advocating for a Quran-only approach. Instead, she's contending that the other sources must be subjected to a hermeneutic of suspicion that gives precedence to the Quranic message and the Quranic ethos. Basically, we need to prioritize the Quran and use it to critically assess the other sources. So until and unless we first understand the Quran, we should not approach the other texts. And when we do approach the other texts, we should do so cautiously. And again, this is an academic historical approach that we're using here. So when we do that, we can look at the pre-Islamic period. And that's what we're going to do. So when we are putting the Quran in context, the context that we are going to look at is the pre-Islamic context, which we know from the jahili or the pre-Islamic poetry and literature. Now, there's a lot of controversy surrounding even the authenticity of that, but the bottom line is that we can use it to derive certain themes that were in the pre-Islamic period. Now, I did want to ask people, you've all heard this term, jahiliyya, or can someone give me what they, you can type it in the box, but just a one-word translation of jahiliyya. Does anybody, can anybody think of what that would be? Okay, so we got a bunch. We got ignorance, exactly. Ignorance, pre-Islamic, thank you. darkness. Perfect, perfect. So it looks like the ijma is on ignorance. Now, that is one of the definitions of jahiliyya. However, as another Western scholar says, there is actually a much better and closer translation. And here, before we get into that, I wanted to talk about semantic fields. Okay, semantic fields, and Khurram is actually getting very close to it, so I like that. Let's talk about the word badtamiz. Now, badtamiz is an Urdu word, and I promised that we weren't going to use any foreign language here, but it's actually good if some of us understand that word and some of us don't. Now, again, in the chat box, can somebody give me a one word? You can only use one word to translate the word badtamiz. Can we see what that would be? Okay, so we got rude, ill-mannered and rude. Okay, perfect. Disrespectful, exactly. Okay, now let me ask you a question. If I went to a king, or I went to, let's say I went to Ghamidi Saab and I said, I said something to him, and then Ghamidi Saab told me something a little bit harsh that I didn't like. Would I then say to some third person, oh, Ghamidi Saab was being very badtamiz to me? Of course not. I would not say that, right? Because that would actually be badtamiz of me to say that. The point is that badtamiz is only said from a position, a higher position to a lower position. So I couldn't call my mom badtamiz, but my mom could and does often call me badtamiz, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that it's very difficult to translate words from one language to another language, all right? So that's why we use something called semantic fields. We don't just translate with a one-word translation, even though we have to do that in a, if you're reading a Quranic translation. But when we try to understand really what a word is, we realize that there are a lot of other words that are associated with badtamiz. And similarly with jahiliyya or jahil, there are other words that are associated with it. But before we get into that, let's talk about the opposite of jahil. The opposite of jahil is hilm. In addition to ilm, which is knowledge, there's also a closer thing, which is hilm, which is the moral reasonableness of a civilized man. That's why I like that translation of civilized. It's somebody who's characterized by forbearance, patience, clemency, someone who's free from blind passion. This goes back to the Greek word ataraxia, a state of freedom from emotional disturbance, tranquility. So jahl, which is the opposite of hilm, can be translated as barbarity, quick to excite and anger, vengeful. This is a good example of jahl. So on the left-hand side, I don't know if people have seen this. I might be dating myself, but that's Jerry Springer. You see a bunch of what they call hillbillies that are fighting each other on silly things. Yes, they are ignorant people, right? They're not educated scholars that are doing this, but they're also quick to anger, right? They're emotional. Now we have the person on the right. He's a Muslim, right? He has a full beard. But I would say that this is jahl, right? He's quick to excite and quick to anger. You'll see him amphibian brain driven. I like that, Reshma. That's a very good translation. So I would argue that these are all good examples of jahl. What are some good examples of hilm? Well, I would tell you, and I'm not just pandering to who's hiring me for this course, but I think Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi is a very good example of someone who displays a lot of hilm. One of the first times I saw Mr. Ghamidi was when I was watching a debate between him and another Pakistani scholar. I won't say his name, Dr. Israr Ahmed, but I saw this debate, and this other scholar was getting very excited and angry. His eyes were popping out, his neck veins were bulging. Meanwhile, Mr. Ghamidi was calm as a pickle. I mean, he was so calm, and you can see him. There's another video of him where he's debating with these three people who are calling him all sorts of things, implying that he's a kafir, etc. Just see how he responds to these people. I couldn't respond this way. I'd probably start giving galia or curse words. But so I think that's a really good example. And there's a YouTube video there that you can see about how Mr. Ghamidi responds to people. The other example that I wanted to give of him, and you may not agree with his politics or not, that's irrelevance. But I'm talking about how Mr. Imran Khan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, dealt with the conflict with India when there was this crisis going on and we were on the verge of war. Pakistan had captured the Indian pilot. What did Mr. Khan do? He released the pilot. This is an example of hilm, forbearance, clemency. What's important to note is that somebody who displays hilm, it's not a weak, lowly person. Rather, it's somebody who's in a position of power. It's actually you're showing your strength with your mercy. So hilm is very much tied to sabr. Now, we often translate this as just patience, but it's not just patience. It's forbearance, and it's doing it from a position of power. As Mr. Ghamidi says, patience means to restrain oneself, that's a typo, restlessness and anxiety, showing perseverance and resolve while encountering hardships. This is the key point in red. This patience is not something akin to weakness and frailty that a person is forced to adopt when he is helpless and weak. On the contrary, it is the fountainhead of determination and resolve. So for example, if you are a small island that was conquered by an empire and you are the island people, there's no way you could really show hilm towards the conquering people. You're in a position of weakness. Hilm is something that's from the upper hand that's given. Here's a very good verse in the Quran in which we see this concept of hilm, and it's juxtaposed to what's a jahil. The servants of the compassionate are those who walk humbly on this earth, and when the jahils address them with words of abuse, they say peace. Now, if you look at a translation of the Quran, they'll often translate the jahil as ignorant or ignoramus, which is true, they are ignorant. That is part of being jahil. But it's really about this kind of vulgarity, this barbarity, this harshness, abuse. And that's being coupled or compared to the servants of God who are humble and slow to anger. So when we look at the pre-Islamic period, and again, why are we starting with the pre-Islamic period? We're trying to look at the Quranic trajectory. Which direction was the Quran going in? We see that the pre-Islamic period was one of war and violence. And it was one of not only violence, but it was of the blood feud, where you had something called thar, which basically, so qisas is a Quranic concept, which means tit for tat. Basically, it's the highest level of violence that you can do in a war, which is equivalent, proportionality. You need to be proportionate. So when the United States carpet bombs a country, that's not observing proportionality. That's going towards disproportionate violence. So in the pre-Islamic period, what we see is that qisas would often break down into thar, which is the blood feud. You kill someone from my tribe, so I kill 2 people from your tribe. Then you retaliate by killing 10 people from my tribe. And this would create an endless cycle of violence. And the reason why they did this is that there was no pre-Islamic state. And so people felt that if they didn't respond in this fashion, their tribe would become vulnerable. So there was a rational reason why they were doing this, but it did result in endless blood feuds. There was the concept of diya, or blood money, financial restitution that you could give. So if someone killed someone from your tribe, instead of attacking someone from their tribe, you could instead say, okay, I will accept financial restitution. Or you could also just forgive. You could grant amnesty. In the pre-Islamic period, these 2 options were considered the sissy options. You were a weak tribe if you accepted either of these options. The Quran is going to reverse this. It's going to say, no, you're actually a halim. You're displaying hilm if you actually go toward these 2 options. So it's reversing the pre-Islamic mentality. So we see in the pre-Islamic period, you're a sissy, you're a woman, and sorry, it's a little bit of sexism there, but this is what they considered if you accepted the diya or the financial restitution. And you had the quintessential example of a pre-Islamic battle or the blood feud, which was called the Harb al-Basus, which was basically started over the killing of a she-camel. This caused a generations-long war between 2 tribes. And the reason was none of the tribes would accept financial restitution. That was considered milk for blood. It was considered the sissy option. So one side would not accept until they have completely annihilated the other side. So now we compare that to the Quranic discourse. the Quranic discourse starts with peace. Not just peace on earth, but it starts with cosmic peace in the heavenly garden. When in the Quranic creation story, when God is creating Adam, the prototypical human being, the angels ask God, will you place therein one who will work corruption therein and shed blood while we hymn your praise and sanctify you? So human beings are the ones who are identified with bloodshed, with violence. Before that, it was cosmic peace in the heavenly garden. And even Mecca, or the Haram, is considered a sacred space. It's sharing in that cosmic peace. It's basically heavenly peace on earth. That's why violence and shedding blood is not allowed in that sacred space. So that is kind of the Quranic cosmology, you can think about it as. And one scholar who talks about this very well is Juan Coley in his book about the Prophet, and I will give you that at the end of this talk. So all of this is linked to the sanctity of life. This verse of the Quran, do not take life which God has made sacred. In the Quran, human life is considered haram. Now we consider haram as something bad, but really what haram means is that you can't kill it, you can't eat it, you can't consume it. So human life in the Quran is sacred. It is haram. Now, when you read this verse, unfortunately, certain exclusivist interpretations came about in the medieval Islamic period, and they kind of understood this as certain lives were sacred and other ones were not. So, and I'll link you to a video that I did on this, but unfortunately in our tradition, they interpreted this as saying, do not take life that God has made sacred, or in the sense that only specific lives are sacred and others are not. I argue, however, that this is not a correct interpretation, because the sanctity of life is rooted in the human creation story itself. God himself breathes into the human soul, and that's why the human soul is divine and sacred. And God said, and the Quran says, God created you from a single soul, and that's how the multitudes of human beings were created. So this is not some silly story. This is actually talking about the sanctity of human life. We all come from the same divine source. And this is the Quranic worldview, that humankind, everyone, we all come from the same source, not only from the same progenitor, Adam, but also our souls are from God himself. So we made you peoples and tribes that you may come to know one another, not fight and kill one another. The first violence, on the other hand, is attributed to Cain and Abel. So we have Cain killing Abel, and what does Abel respond? He says, I shall not stretch forth my hand to kill you. So there's that pacifistic element in the Quran. Now, the Quran does, however, accept the idea of qisas, which I told you is equal retaliation, but that's the upper limit. And the reason why, and the Quran talks about this, the reason why it allows just war, basically, or equal retaliation, is because otherwise there would be chaos on earth, and anyone could attack anyone, and there would be no justice on earth. Again, I have a video on this. I'll link you to that later. But again, the point is that human life is sacred, and you're only allowed to kill someone in this kind of retribution aspect. And even then, and again, this is attributed not only to Cain and Abel, but to Bani Israel. So it's a trans-temporal ethic is what I'm trying to say. Now, fortunately, Mr. Ghamidi is not one who takes this kind of exclusivist attitude, and he does say that all human life is sanctified. But keep in mind, the Quran is pushing, it does say that equal retaliation is okay, but it pushes towards a higher ethic. Why? Because this higher ethic is displaying more hilm. So it does push, it says, in the Torah, we prescribe for them a life for a life. But if anyone forgives this out of charity, it will serve as atonement for his bad deeds. This is actually something surprising for many people who think of Islam as this strict justice, that an eye for an eye religion, that unlike Christianity, which has this turn the other cheek, Islam has this kind of, eye for an eye mentality. That is completely not Quranic, at least. Okay, so I have a question. If human life is sacred, then how about the concept of jihad? So I have a video that I gave a lecture on the topic of jihad. I did want to include it in this, but it would get too lengthy, so I'm going to refer you to that. And if you have any further questions, you can definitely ask me about that. So that was a private question that I had received. Okay, so in the pre-Islamic period, we have people going to excess in retaliation for one death. We have a retaliation killing 1,300 people. So that's what Islam came to kind of balance. That's the context that the Quran came in. In addition to war and violence, we also have social and economic injustices. So keep in mind, okay, so this is a little bit of Ibn Khaldun for you, but basically societies can be divided into kind of the urban society and then the tribal Bedouin kind of society. We kind of think of Bedouin society as uncivilized and backward, but it does have certain advantages. Bedouin society is more egalitarian. Now, everybody does live on a subsistence level, but they're more equal. The disparity is much less. Whereas what was happening in the pre-Islamic time was that the Meccan population was becoming more sedentary. That was good in one way. It became more wealthy as a city, but the wealth did become more stratified. That society became more class-based. So just like in America, we have more wealth than many third world countries. The range of the richest compared to the poorest is quite large. Similarly, this is what was going on in Mecca at that time. According to the Quranic worldview, this is a bad thing. In this verse, it says, when we, that is God, desire to destroy a town, that is a civilization, we command those who live a life of luxury within it, yet they continue to commit inequity therein, so the word comes due against it and we annihilate it completely. Now, I take the view of Fazl ar-Rahman, and Ibn Khaldun also takes this view, who is a classical Islamic scholar, that the Quran uses both naturalistic and religious idioms to describe all the world phenomena. We can get into this discussion later, but the point here is that there was this social and economic injustice that was prevalent at this time. And that's important to understand the Quranic trajectory. So let's review, and then we're going to go to questions after that. So what were the kind of jahili ailments that the Quran and the Prophet were identifying? There was certainly the concept of idolatry. We'll talk about that. There was tribal violence and bloodshed. There was socioeconomic injustice. There was also sexual depravity and also a lot of wine drinking. Basically this guy. This is the kind of conception you can have of the Jahili mentality. Now, why is sexual depravity and wine, why is that associated with, what does that have to do with hilm? Well, according to the, going all the way back to the Greeks, there is this idea that in order to quell the passions, the part of your soul that deals with this kind of passionate response where you respond with violence, you have to tame the sexual aspect of yourself. And also, if you're imbibing a lot of wine, think about it. Somebody like the guy in this picture, you can imagine getting into bar fights and that sort of thing. So it's all kind of connected to this Quranic conception of the Jahili mentality. Okay, I do have a question here. I'm going to pull it. And you can actually, if you would like, you can ask the questions in public as well. That's perfectly fine. So it says, I'm reading the question now. Doesn't the concept of qisas lead to violence again? One tribe killing a guy and the other killing in response, and this continues. Isn't forgiveness the only solution to end this bloodshed? I agree with you. And this, thank you, Usman, for asking this question. And again, I'm going to link you to my discussion on jihad. My conclusion, and actually this is the dissertation work that I do is on this topic. My argument is that the Quran calls for patience, sabr, and even pacifism, except for if the threat has become existential, that your religious community is going to be annihilated if you don't do anything. In that case of existential threats, then retaliation is justified. But even then, the highest you can go is proportionality. And even then, once you get the upper hand, you should then keep the door of forgiveness open. But again, this is a whole discussion in itself, and I will link you towards something on that. So we got another question. Is the inclination then towards asceticism? Khurram, thank you for the question. So what I would say is that there are definitely texts that point in both directions. There are hadith, of course, that say that the kind of say monasticism has no place in Islam, that you do need to take care of your worldly affairs. And there are other texts that seem to indicate that asceticism would be in line with the Quranic and Islamic ethos. What I would say is probably a balanced view on this would probably make a lot of sense, that zuhud or asceticism, some element of it is not a bad thing, but at the same time to take care of your worldly affairs. But this is an open question, and I'm sure some people have more questions on this. So Faraz has a question on this about the Sahaba's conquests. I think I'm going to have to refer you to the video. I don't answer that in that, but I think that we're going to have to move on this topic, because jihad is a whole lecture in itself. And the point of here, this lecture is not on jihad. And you're going to see I'm going to have those slides. I'm going to make those part of the deep dive, as you'll see. All right. So Muhammad Ali is asking, what about God killing people via natural disaster? And what about the law of Itmam Hujjat? So I'm going to talk about Itmam Hujjat later, which is a theory put forward by Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. As far as God killing people via natural disaster, this is a topic that is a theological, philosophical question that is, there are many different viewpoints on this, and there's no way that I could unfortunately do justice to this in this short talk, so I apologize for that. So I'm going to move on, and then we're going to take a break. Let's see what time it is. Yeah, it's just about time to take a break. So we'll take a break within 10 minutes. All right. So the Prophet is born in 570 CE in Mecca, and that's the background. He was orphaned at a young age. That's important to keep in mind, right? Because he came from a noble family, but because he was orphaned, he came from a noble family that was to some extent impoverished. And that's important because that we see that ethos in the prophetic message, right? He has a deep care and concern for orphans and vulnerable populations, as well as he has this concern for economic justice as well. Now, as far as life events that occurred before the Prophet declared prophethood, from an academic perspective, we're a little bit hesitant about a lot of it, but we do know that there are reports that the Prophet took part in this League of the Virtuous. Sorry, I'm having some problems with viewing my own screen, but basically this was a league that had two purposes. One was to bring an end to the blood feud, and the second was to make sure that there was a social and economic justice to these widows, orphans, the poor, and the elderly. So this was a concern of the Prophet even before he declared himself a prophet. So what's obvious is that the Prophet was pained by widespread immorality and social malaise. And this is why the Prophet at a young age was already beginning his retreats, where he was going to meditate, to pray, when he was then informed that he was a prophet by God. All right, so right before the break, there was one other big point that I wanted to do. So we've talked about what jahiliyya is and what the jahili ethos is. However, I want to go away from the extreme of saying that there was nothing good in the jahili period whatsoever. So as Professor Uzutsu says, we would, and this is in the yellow that's bolded, we would do a grave injustice, however, to the spirit of jahiliyya and even to the position of Islam if we suppose that the latter period, the jahiliyya period, Islam denied and rejected without discrimination all the moral ideals of pre-Islamic Arabia as essentially incompatible. Instead, and this is the second bolded part, the Quran adopted and revived in a new form suited to the needs of monotheism many of the outstanding virtues of paganism. There's a certain respect in which we might perhaps speak of the moral aspect of Islam, even as a restoration of some of the old Arab ideals and nomadic virtues which had degenerated in the hands of the wealthy merchants of Mecca, again, as they become sedentary before the rise of this religion. So let's talk about that pre-Islamic, some things that you may not be familiar with. The first is that, yes, even though they did do idolatry, the pre-Islamic Arabs believed in Allah. They believed in God. We have this proof from the Quran itself. It says when they, the pagans, they board a ship, they call upon Allah, devoting religion entirely to him. Now, they ascribe partners to him, but they do believe in him. The other thing is that even though they believed in Allah, they had, and their idols, they did have lukewarm belief in their idols and God. The reason is if you build your own idol and you have multiple idols, it kind of spreads out that belief. You can take one God one week and another God another week. And if one God doesn't give what you want, you can go to another God. This created this element of kind of a lukewarm belief. The other thing is, even though they believed in God, they had intermediaries to God, which was their idols, and they believed they had a strong concept of intercession before God. They believed that I'm not holy enough to go to God directly, so I need intercessors from whom I can ask to then approach God. And we know this from the Quran itself. So again, the point is that the Jahili period did believe in God, even though they associated with God. There were certain Jahili virtues that I wouldn't call them Jahili virtues, I would call them pre-Islamic virtues, which the Quran restores and modifies and brings to a higher ethic. So these are kind of the Islamic code of chivalry. These include generosity. So pre-Islamic Arabs were very generous people. Think about any tribal kind of people that they're very generous. The Quran is actually tempering their generosity. These pre-Islamic Arabs would sometimes tell stories where they would give all of their wealth and then be left destitute. So the Quran did call towards moderation. The other thing is it redirected this generosity. So the pre-Islamic Arabs would make a big show of their generosity. And the Quran says, no, you should actually be more, do it for God instead of for this, showing off and arrogance. All right, the other thing is courage. Courage was definitely something that the pre-Islamic Arabs, their tribal warriors, they definitely displayed courage on the battlefield. But again, this courage was built into this arrogance of basically, I want to get fame. And they didn't believe in the hereafter. They believed in shuhra, that fame, the only way to become eternal was for you to, die and everybody remember you and sing your praises. So the Quran is eliminating this aspect. They were loyal. The pre-Islamic Arabs were loyal people. Think about any tribal kind of people that they're very loyal. But they were even loyal to a fault. There are many pre-Islamic sayings where they would basically say, my tribe, right or wrong. The Quran, and there's actually a pre-Islamic saying in which they say, help your tribe whether they oppress or they are the oppressors. The Prophet, there's a hadith in which the same thing is said, except the Prophet says, somebody asked him, what do you mean help them if they're oppressing? And what the Prophet responded was by stopping them from oppressing others. So the Quran, and there's a verse in the Quran especially where it says, stand for justice, even if it be against yourself or your kin or your tribe. So the Quran is saying, yes, being loyal is important, but still stand for impartiality and justice. So veracity, truthness, and patience. But Quran is elevating patience to a higher level. And again, sabr and hilm were things that existed in the pre-Islamic period, but they were kind of overwhelmed by this kind of tribal boasting and arrogance. So this is the last slide, and then we'll go for a 10-minute break. So the religious landscape before Islam, we see that the Arab pagans were there. They believed in Allah, but they were henotheists. Sorry, I should define henotheist. Henotheist is someone who does believe in God, Allah, but they associate God with other secondary gods. The other thing is that Salat, Zakat, Som, and Hajj, all of these were done in the pre-Islamic period. This may surprise people, but we have plenty of evidence of this, that these were in the pre-Islamic period, but what Islam did was purify and modify them. And in the Quranic conception, these things are not particular things to just Islam with a capital I. No, these are things that go back to all religions, to prototypical man. These things, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and pilgrimage, these are things that were part of the pre-Islamic and also, just not in Arabia, but in the Quranic conception overall. All right, and they were also Hanifs, or which were monotheists. We have some Western scholars aren't quite sure what to make of the Hanifs, who exactly they were, but they seem to be primordial, like monotheists on the Abrahamic line. They would attribute themselves to Abraham. So the Prophet is, and there were Jews and Christians as well in the Arabian context. So what the Prophet is basically doing is he's bringing together all of these groups together under one kind of refined worldview. So that's it. I think we're going to take a break. I do have a couple questions. Let me see if... Okay, so one question I got in private was the traditions that such circumambulations around the Kaaba was a pagan tradition. Also, weren't some of the traditions embraced by Islam to ensure there was an easier way to propagate Islam? Well, I would agree with the first part. I would kind of hesitate at the second part. I think that we have this, it's part of the way we approach religion, that we think that the Prophet created everything de novo by himself, that the Quran, Islam is just a complete break from everything that came before it. In fact, the Prophet is commanded to say in the Quran that he doesn't bring anything new. I think this is actually a beautiful thing. It shows that the Quran is bringing all of these threads together and uniting them in this Quranic worldview. So that's the way that I see it. Mr. Javed Iqbal asked, which month did they observe the fast? I'm not sure about that. I would have to look into that. I'm not sure, so I'd have to look into that. I apologize. All right, so I think we'll now take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you after the break. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Thank you. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Can everyone hear me just fine?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen, hopefully not mess this up. All right. Okay, and so actually I'll get back to that. All right, so let's get started again. Let me see if I can get the chat box back. Where did it go? Stop the share for a second. Participants. Can someone help me again how I can make sure that the chat box is visible? Because when I press play, I see the participants, but I don't see the chat box.
It won't be on your keynote. It'll be on your Zoom toolbar or something that's displaying on your screen. I can't see Zoom
The top.
app on your screen.
Okay, on my screen, I'm seeing mute, stop video security, participants, new
Yes,
share.
so participants is the one that'll...
Okay, so I see a list of participants, but I don't see the chat box.
It should be below it.
Maybe more.
Next to participants, look at more. That's where chat is.
Okay, so more, I clicked on it. I see.
Yes, please click more.
Still don't see it. This is frustrating. I see mute participants, allow participants, play, enter, lock meeting, enable waiting room.
Minimize your screen a bit. Maybe it's behind it.
Okay. Here's the talking head at least. That's frustrating. Let me see if maybe if I chat with one person in specific, let's see.
I tried sending you.
Oh, there we go. There we go. It was hiding somewhere.
That's
Okay.
what I thought.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's see now if I can get it to be. So I'm gonna minimize this guy right here. Put it here. Okay, so I did have a question in the break. What about capital punishment? Isn't it good to send message to the masses that you cannot harm others by setting an example through capital punishment? Okay, so this is obviously up to an individual to make that decision about whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, or it's a confession. If you want to say that the Quran tells you about that, then I think that's a confessional statement. From my perspective, the only claim that I'm making today is the point that surprised me when I looked into this issue is that on a crime such as murder, the Quran does not seem to, and even in this classical Islamic tradition, murder was something that the family, the tribal unit, the representatives could actually forgive. So where you want to go with that, that's up to you, which direction you want to go in. I have my own views, but I don't want to sidetrack this too much. All right, so we're starting here. We've talked about the pre-Islamic period. We talked about what it means to be jahil, what the jahiliyya period was, and the hilm, that civilization or civilized mannerisms that the Quran was calling towards and the Prophet was calling towards. And the Prophet was the halim, right? He was the ultimate expression of that characteristic of hilm. So he was age 40 when he got the prophetic call. What did Islam, what was the main kind of call of Islam? Well, there's first radical monotheism in the sense of henotheism. So we're contrasting it with that. Now, monotheism is not just about believing in one God. It's about your actions. And more importantly, it's about displaying tawakkul or reliance on God. That ultimately you rely only upon God. And that is really where this monotheistic aspect comes about. There was also this concept of taqwa. Taqwa is piousness, it is God-fearingness, God consciousness. We might be in this habit of wanting to stay away from saying God-fearing because Muslims have been typecasted as kind of fire and brimstone. And I agree, we ourselves have done this, unfortunately. I mean, you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're burning in hell for this long period. So I agree with that pushback. But I would say that I do think that the Quran is calling away from a state of ghafla, which is heedlessness, that the pre-Islamic period was drenched in, and I think which our materialistic world were drenched in. Ghafla, or heedlessness, is the state of man, of human, is to be in a state of unawareness of their true divine nature, divine purpose, taking care of others. All of this is ghafla. And so the Quran is calling back toward that. So there is this element of fearing God in this God-conscious kind of way. So what the Prophet was doing, or what the Quran was doing, it was turning the direction of Arabs away from paganism and towards, sorry, I have to hide this chat box a little bit. Having a hard time seeing it on my end. All right. Turning Arabs away from paganism and towards Abrahamic monotheism, which was portrayed as this primordial religion. And the Quran links the Prophet Muhammad to Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. And this is very important because now we're turning the ruh, the kind of the direction of the Arabs, of the Muslims, towards this Western Judeo-Christian Abrahamic faith tradition. So sometimes we think of Islam as kind of an Eastern religion, but even from an academic standpoint. Islam is very much a Western tradition. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the Western traditions. But at the same time, the Quran also mentions prophets and Arab that were sent to Arab people that are not mentioned in the biblical stories. And these tribes that are mentioned, these can be considered the primal Arabs. So again, what is the Quran doing? It's bringing all of these strands together into one cohesive narrative. The Prophet and the Quran are addressing all of these and tying them together into one reformed community. As I put it, one nation under God, indivisible, with religious liberty and justice for all. I think this is the best way to describe what the Prophet was calling towards. And I'm going to really talk about this religious liberty aspect. I talk about this in one of the deep dive videos I'm going to make, and also the video on jihad that I will link to. The Quran is also universalistic in its outlook. We're going from tribal to universal ethics, right? When in tribal ethics, you all have your various gods, and your ethics are dictated by what is considered proper by the tribe. So we've been doing this for generations. This is how our people do it. This is what we do. The Quran is saying, no, we should do what's right. Basically, you have one God who has so there's this universalization of ethics. So good and bad is not subjective anymore. It goes back to this heavenly aspect. Now, we often hear that, as someone who studies Islamic bioethics, I often hear people say that, the West is individualistic and Islam is communalistic or communitarian, sorry. But if we read the Quran, and Fazl Rahman really makes this point, that the Quran goes out of its way to create man as an individual under God, and that man has personal responsibility to God. There are many verses along these lines. No soul shall bear the burden of another. There's actually stories of people coming to the Prophet and saying, don't worry, we'll take care of you. Your sins will, because the Prophet would say, no, I have to do this. I'm on this divine mission. And they would say, don't worry, we'll take your sins upon our heads. Don't worry, it's all good. We'll take care of it. The Quran is basically saying, no one can take the sins of anyone else. So it creates the individual. Not only does it create the individual, but all human beings come from one soul. So, O humankind, we saw this again. Truly, we created you from a male and a female, and we made you peoples and tribes that you may come to know one another. Surely the most noble of you before God are the most righteous of you. Truly, God is knowing, aware. So here we see that what the Quranic ethic is doing, it's creating the human being before God. Everyone is equal before God, and the only way they differ is in terms of their taqwa, or their righteousness, how God-fearing that they are. This is quite a remarkable passage. We kind of take it for granted. We live in a society in which it's taken for granted that people are created equal, so we kind of can just blow past this. But this is quite radical. In a tribal society where hierarchy is everything, the Quran is breaking this down, not just between male and female, that before God everyone is equal, but also all these peoples and tribes, they're all equal. So I think this is quite a fascinating thing that we should not just breeze by because now it's commonly accepted in the West. No, this is something that's quite radical. And we have this speech that's attributed to the Prophet, his farewell sermon that is, it sums up this ethos quite nicely. And there are many different variations of this, but this is the kind of a common theme. O people, your Lord is one and your Father is one. All of you are from Adam, and Adam was from dust. So again, that humbleness. Remember, there was this haughtiness of jahiliyya, that I'm from this tribe, I'm this great, person from this lineage. The Quran is leveling all of that, and it's saying, no, you're all from one source. You're all from Adam. And by the way, Adam was from dust, nothing. The noblest of you in God's sight is the most righteous. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab. A white person has no superiority over a black person, nor the other way around. This is radical. Think about this. This is like 1960s, 1950s, this was not accepted in America. And we're talking about 1400 years ago. There's this complete leveling of the playing field, and people are equal except for based on their deeds. I think this is quite fascinating. All right, so I do have some questions. Let's see. All right. I have from Muhammad. Would you read it? Okay, I'm just gonna just give me 1 second. Okay, so the question is, and this is from Chaplain Muhammad Ali. Thank you for joining us. We have a respected scholar in his own right, and I appreciate that he's here with us. He said, would you agree that the Quranic message has a gradual approach? It didn't only seek the perfect ideal, it sought at times to offer solutions for where people were or are at. People do not go from depravity to the highest human ideal overnight. Even if an individual does, as society is a different story. Well, Imam Muhammad, I totally agree with you. That's why I say that we should look at that's why I think it's interesting to look at the Quranic trajectory. What direction is the Quran going to? I do, and this is what Fazl Rahman called the double movement, where we look at the context in which the Quran was revealed, the trajectory in which the Quran was going, and then we look at the context that we live in today in order to properly apply that trajectory. So this is called trajectory hermeneutics. This is my personal take on it, and people may differ on this. So I got another question. Okay, Umar asks, how would you reconcile this individualistic view with the fact that congressional prayers, just as an example, are regarded as higher than individual prayers based on my humble understanding? Umar, thank you for the excellent question. So yes, in a few slides, I'm going to show you how even though I'm saying that the Quran did create the individual, at the same time, the social aspect is very important in Islam. So we're going to get to that. Hopefully that will answer your question. If it doesn't, please shoot me another question. And then we have a question from Atif. You have mentioned Fazl Rahman. Who is he? So this is not Maulana Diesel, by the way, a Pakistani Maulana today. Fazl Rahman was a professor at the University of Chicago, a Pakistani scholar. He spent some time in Pakistan, but he is a major Western Muslim academic from which many Muslims in the academy are influenced, including myself. So he has a book called Major Themes of the Quran, which I am going to reference at the end in the optional readings. All right, so then I have a question from Anis about religious liberty. Was it even an option in the presence of Prophet of God besides the Abrahamic religions? So I think this is, if I understand this correctly, that would be a question about Itmam Hujjat, probably, if I'm understanding that question correctly. I think I'm going to have to shelf that question for now. I'm going to link to my jihad discussion, and then we'll briefly discuss the theory of Itmam Hujjat as well. Okay, so I'm going to keep, okay, I'm going to keep going now, and I'll come back to questions. All right. So we'll carry forward. Thank you for your questions. And thank you all for coming here. Thank you for your fasting lecture. Thank you very much for being here. Okay. So the Quran is also, in addition to monotheism, right? Belief in the one God, the Quran is also talking about the day of reckoning, the day of judgment. This is also a change from Jahili ethics. They did not believe in an afterlife. The Quran is replete with verses in which they are kind of doubting the afterlife. The reason is and that's why they believe in the shuhra, or fame. That's the only way to become eternal, is through your fame. The Quran is saying, no, there is this afterlife. And the importance of the afterlife is that there is a day of reckoning. There is a day in which you will stand trial for all that you have done, whether good or bad. There will be recompense. What does this do? This creates personal responsibility. Be mindful of a day that no soul will avail another soul in any way, and no intercession shall be accepted from it, nor ransom taken from it, nor shall anyone be helped by anyone else. The other thing that the Quran is doing is there is this sense of apocalyptic thought in the Quran. That is, the hour is imminent, all right? This is not something that we should shy away from or be embarrassed about. In the Quranic worldview, the hour is always imminent. Why? Because our lives pass by so quickly. I thought yesterday I was just 25 and now I'm knocking on the door to 40. This is what the Quran is talking about, that you, not only is your life going to come to an end, that you're going to come to your personal day of reckoning, but also the universal day of reckoning, the hour is also imminent. And why? Why is this important? Because it's creating this sense of urgency in the human being to be responsible for their actions. So this goes back to this sense of individualism. And these are just some verses I picked out that talk about this individualistic aspect. There's also a sense of salvific uncertainty in at least some of the Quranic verses. We're going to talk about in the deep dive about different views about salvation. And there is a view of salvific exclusivity. Salvific, by the way, just means whether a person is saved in the hereafter, whether they will go to heaven or hell, basically salvation. But in the Quran, we do note that there is this sense of people should be uncertain. At least in some verses, it seems to say this, where the Prophet himself is made to say, I know not what will be done with me or with you. There's another verse in which there's one verse in which it seems like the Prophet doesn't know what's definitely going to happen with him, but there's another verse where the Prophet is made to say, and this verse, the context of this verse is said to be in a battle in which the Prophet is being attacked and his enemies are trying to kill him. He's got a broken tooth, he's bleeding from the head, and the Prophet at this time basically said something along the lines of, what will happen to such a people who attack their own prophets, like almost not even cursing them, but almost getting there. And the Quran, then this verse is said to be revealed in this episode, and it says, not for you, O Muhammad, but for God is the decision, whether he relents upon them or he punishes them. So there's this salvific uncertainty about the individual as well as towards the other. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take an anthropocentric reading of the Quran. Now, it is true that the Quran talks about God and all of that, but I believe, just like Fazl Rahman, that the Quran is a document that is squarely aimed at man. The aim of the Quran is is man and his behavior. That is, how do we get man to take responsibility for his actions and act in a way, not only in his individual life, but in his social life in a proper manner. So this is what the Quran is trying to do. I think we should understand the Quran as homily, a religious discourse that is intended primarily for ethical and spiritual edification, rather than for doctrinal instruction or scientific explanation, historical reporting, or political action. Now, you might take it in all of those directions, that's up to you. But what I'm saying is that the primary aspect is this ethical and spiritual edification. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a functional reading of the Quran. The Quran is not narrating these past stories of the prophets for no reason. It's not that we need to compile these into history books and then just read them and just say this is, leave it to the side. No, the reason why these stories of these past nations and these prophetic stories are being narrated to us is because they're applying them to the prophetic moment. That look, the Prophet's people, the Prophet Muhammad's people are rejecting him, and look at what happened. This happened to past prophets, and look what happened to past nations. This is why the Quran is revealing what it is. So the aim is not merely to describe, but to prescribe. That is, to prescribe proper behavior. So Mr. Ghamidi also talks about how this idea of the Day of Judgment is necessary for man's own quest for justice. And this is actually very similar to a German Enlightenment thinker's thought. He made the moral law argument for the existence of God and the hereafter. That is, if we don't believe in the hereafter, we will drop into a sense of nihilism, purposelessness in life. Our actions will not have meaning. So what the Quran is doing is it's making us remind us of our divine origin, and also that our actions have transcendental results, basically. So we look at a verse like this. What's a functional reading do? So let's look at this verse, verse 262. We see whosoever believes in God and the last days, we can think of that as one component. And then 2, works deeds of righteousness. These two things go hand in hand. And the reason why, from a functional aspect, you need to believe in God on the last day is so that you know that your deeds, those deeds of righteousness, that you are actually going to somewhere you're going to be accounted for them. So this is why, and this is Immanuel Kant's argument for the existence of God in the hereafter, by the way. So if you look at prayer, approximately 1/6 of the Quran mentions prayer. This begs the question, why is prayer so important? Now, there are many reasons why it could be important. I'm going to give just one reason. I think prayer creates the right disposition in a person in relation to God, but also within one's own self. It creates a sense of humbleness, patience, and hilm, right? This is why prayer is often tied in the Quran to patience. Seek help in patience and prayer. Be humble. If we look at fasting, why is fasting prescribed? Why? Because fasting also creates it's this idea of self-restraint. You have this jahili impulse to be emotional, to wage war, to have all sorts of fornication and adultery. Fasting is taming that lower desires of yourself. So it tames the passions, sexual and violent nature of man. Now, Omar had asked a great question that, there is this individualistic aspect of the Quran, but there's also this social aspect of the Quran. Piety this is a very powerful verse of the Quran. It says, piety is not that you turn your faces toward the east or the west in prayer, but true piety is in the one who believes in God and who gives wealth, etc., helps the orphans, the needy, the migrants, the beggars, who emancipates slaves, people who are patient in misfortune, hardship, and moments of peril. Here's another verse talking about the steep ascent. What is the steep ascent? It is to free the slave, to give food in the time of famine, to help the poor man reduced to beggary, to be patient, to be compassionate. Now keep in mind, in the steep ascent is still prayer and doing those things. That's still a very important aspect of it. The point here is that the individual is important, but so is the social. So what is the Quranic worldview? What is it doing? It's creating this social ethic where everybody is under one God. We're all from one origin, a lowly origin, by the way. We have one goal and one return destination, that is God. Your wealth is not yours. You and your wealth are on loaner. You must account for your wealth before God, and you must purify your wealth. You have an obligation to your fellow human beings and to your community. You need to be kind to others so that God is kind to you. God is watching over you, and he will punish you if you oppress in the land. And the Quran has this recurrent concern for vulnerable persons, women, slaves, orphans, the poor, those in debt, beggars, the weak, oppressed. And I was going to make the break at this time. I think what I'm going to try to do actually is try to finish up and then go to discussion, and then everything else I'll put into the deep dive. So in this section, this is the deep dive section. I'm just going to go through it. I've had a lot of questions about jihad. So this whole section is about jihad. All right. So, and there right here is the video that I would ask you to look at. It's on War and Peace. This is a guest lecture I gave on this topic, if you want my view of it. All right, and then we talk about inclusive and exclusive readings of the Quran. Okay, the upshot of all of this is that if we take a certain reading of the Quran, we could take Islam to not just mean the capital I Islam, that is how we think of it today, but a lowercase Islam in the sense of a primordial monotheistic religion of submission to the one God. And a really great explanation I've heard, we talk about submission and it kind of has this negative aspect to it, but the way Aisha Bayuni, who is a Bayuniya, who was a Sufi mystic, the way she described it, the believers are to surrender themselves to God and willingly accept his loving grace. This is what the Quran is calling towards. All right, so let me just blow through all of this. Last point I wanted to talk about is semantic fields again. And this is when I want to compare Iman and Kufr. So the example I wanted to give is an English word, acknowledge. The word acknowledge, it can mean to admit the fact of something. So the reason why I have our lovely president here is, I acknowledge that President Trump is our president. I'm just acknowledging that that's a fact. I could recognize the authority of that. I could say, I acknowledge that if the president ordered me to do something by law, as long as it was constitutional, I would have the obligation to follow it. So that's another level of the word acknowledge. So I acknowledge the president. And but somebody who lives outside of America, who's not an American citizen, they would only do the first acknowledge, right? They would acknowledge that Trump is the president of the United States, but they would not acknowledge the authority of the president because they don't live in America. And then finally, you have a third aspect of acknowledge, which is to express appreciation of. So this one, certainly I don't do of President Trump, right? I don't acknowledge him in this way. So similarly, I could acknowledge that Ghamidi Saab is the founder of Ghamidi Center. I could recognize his authority of it, but I could also acknowledge him that he's done all this hard work. And so I could acknowledge him on these three different levels. Similarly, scholars have argued that there are different levels of Iman. Yes, there's the to believe in God and his prophet from an intellectual level, but there's also a deeper meaning, to be grateful to God. And then it's also to be faithful to God and his prophets. All right, so there's these three different levels. And Iman, if we just stay at this first level, that's not real Iman. Iman is all of these three levels of belief, gratefulness, and faithfulness. So many atheists, new atheists like Sam Harris, they want to characterize faith as belief without sufficient evidence. They kind of mock it as such. But this is because they're understanding faith in that first definition only. But in reality, the proper meaning of faith is trust or confidence in someone or something. That is what ultimate faith is. It's reliance in God, or tawakkul. And there are many different verses that point us in this direction. So who are the mu'minun? They are those who put their trust in their Lord. Similarly, the word kufr, there are different levels of kufr. And whether you take one, make this and or, that's up to you. I tend to take the and approach. There's some people who take the or approach, and we'll talk about this in the deep dive when we come to inclusivist or exclusivist interpretations. But we can all at least acknowledge that there are levels of kufr. So there's the intellectual disbelief in God, that's to disbelieve in God intellectually. But there's also to be ungrateful to God. Kufr in the Quran is used in this ungrateful aspect in many places. And then there's a third meaning, which is to be faithless in the sense of disloyalty and treachery towards God and his prophet. This is very relevant in the aspect of jihad. When the Quraysh, they oppressed the prophets, this was actually considered treachery because they were attacking their own kinsmen. This was not allowed under tribal ethics to do what they did. And the Quran makes them aware of this, that you are committing treachery by doing this thing. So these are the different levels of kufr. This is a Bravman, who's M.M. Bravman, who's a scholar, a Western scholar, and he talks about these three different levels of kufr. I'll link to it at the end of this discussion. So if we look at these verses of the Quran, we can see how kufr is used to mean ungrateful. In one verse, Pharaoh accuses Moses of being a kafir, of being ungrateful to him, because after all, Pharaoh raised Moses. There's also kufr that's denied of God. God can be accused of kufr. But the Quran negates kufr from God, saying that if you do a good deed, God will make sure that you're recompensed for your good deed. He won't show you ingratitude, kufr, kufran, right? And there are two different roots, but we're not going to get into that. And here you have kufr, ungratefulness, juxtaposed with shukr, or thanks. So these two things are opposites of each other. Just like we saw hilm being opposed to jahl, here we see kufr opposed to shukr or thanks. What is the Quran asking? It's asking you to give thanks and do not be ungrateful. Do not show this kufr to God. Now the Quran is saying that most human beings are actually ungrateful. They're kafirun from this aspect. So who is a kafir? Well, these are all different words that the Quran uses for description of the word a kafir. All right. I believe that all of these are applicable, and I don't think it's just disbeliever from the sense of intellectually disbelieving, but this is up to you whether you take that inclusivist interpretation or the exclusivist one, and we'll talk about that later. And we see here in this, in these verses, this is also, I believe this is Bravman's or Uzutsu. I don't remember which one it is, which text it is. I'll look it up. But here we see that the Quran itself shows this parallelism where kafirun is parallel to zalimun. Zalimun is oppressor, is the wrongdoer. And the fasikun, same way, rebellious kind of person. So we see this parallelism in the Quran. The point is that I don't think we should take kafir to be synonymous with ghair Muslim. Uzutsu makes this point, but Mr. Javed Ahmad Ghamidi also makes this point. And there's a video over there that I recommend you to go to. I don't have time to go into Itmam al-Hujjat. I think I'm running out of time. I think the upshot of it is that kafir with a capital K does not refer to any non-Muslim out there. I think we're misreading the Quran if we do that. Instead, it refers to a specific group of people who not only rejected their prophet, but oppressed, expelled, and tried to kill the messenger and his followers. That is really who the capital K kafir being talked about in the Quran is. So I think Quran should be, this is my own viewpoint, I think kafir should be translated as rejector and refer to those specific people in a particular time and place who not only rejected the prophet, but also who were actively inimical and hostile to them in word and deed. Now, there is a general aspect to this as well, that kufr can be manifested in any human being, even a Muslim. And here's a verse of the Quran that I would point you to. O you who believe, eat the good things we have provided you and be grateful to God, if it is God that you worship. So even believers are warned not to be ungrateful. And this is one thing that Professor quote from Professor Lantley, she says basically that we shouldn't use these kind of simple static threshold criteria to say that, oh, I'm a Muslim, so therefore I can't commit kufr or I can't commit X, Y, and Z, and I'm saved just because I belong to this group of people called Muslim with a capital M. So this is a book by Professor Lantley. That's, I think, her maiden name. She now goes by Rhodes, Never Hold the Other. I strongly recommend this book. She makes a difference between lateral and hierarchical communities. This is not as complicated as it sounds. Basically, she says that according to the Quranic worldview, you have these lateral communities. So you have Jews, you have Christians, you have Muslims. These are lateral communities. This is not how God judges in the hereafter. Just like you have man and women, this difference does exist. Men are different than women. That's a lateral difference. But that's not a difference that God will judge us based upon. God only judges us based on hierarchical differences. And remember we talked about earlier that the only way that we're different from a hierarchical standpoint is based on our own taqwa, our righteousness, how God-fearing we are. So this is what she argues, and I agree with her. And according to the Quranic logic, God could have made us all one community, but he made us into these different tribes and communities. So why? So we could race with one another in good deeds. This is part of the Quranic logic. And we will be judged on an individual level. This is a great quote by Professor Lamptey. She basically says that we can't group all Jews and Christians into one box. Some will display taqwa and some do not display taqwa. It's important to keep in mind that even early Muslims consisted of hypocrites, munafiqun, who were kafirs. So again, this is one quote by Lamptey, again, saying basically the same thing. I'm trying to go a little bit quickly here. My bottom line point is that even though we're going to talk, I'm going to link you to the video about jihad, the bottom line is that the Prophet's final stance towards his people was one of hilm. He granted a general amnesty to his people and called for peace and reconciliation once they took Makkah in a bloodless coup. Final point, I think we're running out of time now. The Quran is calling to the good life, all right? We have this concept of that only Western liberalism talks about happiness. But the Quran talks a lot about felicity or happiness. It's telling the person how to have the good life. But the only difference is that it's not only a good life in this world, but more importantly, much more importantly, is to have a good life in the hereafter. So what's the assessment? Once we've understood the Quran in this way, looking at the ethical trajectory of the Quran, understanding the Quran on its own terms, we're able to understand this underlying ethos that may be missed if we just look at verses atomistically or subatomistically and just say, okay, what's the ruling on X and Y? What's the ruling? Is this halal or is this haram? No, there's a different way and a deeper way of reading the Quran. And seeking the ethical trajectory allows us to better appreciate the relevance of the Quran to our present situation. Okay, so reviewing, the Prophet called us to hilm, peace, to live as one united community under a loving and protecting God, to take responsibility for our own actions, to act justly and righteously, and to fear God, to enjoin goodness and eschew wickedness on earth, to love and care for your brother and sister in humanity as God loves and cares for you. Finally, and I'm gonna take questions afterward. All of this, I think we should appreciate what Islam does for us as a civilization, as a people. In evolutionary psychology, there are views of religion as either being a parasite, a byproduct, or an evolutionary adaptation. New atheists believe that religion is a parasite, that it latches on and reproduces itself like COVID-19. But I would argue that Islamic monotheism, the Quran, conferred upon its civilizational holders a distinct evolutionary advantage. In fact, it was rocket fuel. Think about this. The pre-Islamic Arabs were a tribal people, uncivilized, who never created a great civilization, ever. You can go hundreds of years back. The Persian Empire did, the Byzantine Empire, they had in Syria and in that area. But that Arabian Peninsula, that Hijaz had never created a civilizational, world power. But as soon as this Quranic message came, suddenly those Arabs, they had this rocket fuel where they jet forward, and all of a sudden they become a world power. So the Quran, the Islam, took a lowly tribal people engaged in petty infighting, united them, and allowed them to vanquish two great empires in the world and cast them into a world power. Islamic monotheism enabled universal ethics. It enabled philosophy and science, culture and art, higher civilization. We're going to talk about science later, but think about it. If you have different tribal gods or different gods, one is controlling rain and one is controlling something else, you don't have this kind of universal law of nature. But once you have this idea that there's this one God who's controlling not only our ethics, but also our natural law, this sets the stage for philosophy and science. And that's why shortly thereafter, Muslims advance and create, have their quote unquote golden age as far as that is concerned. And we're going to talk about that in another class. This is a question I ask. In an increasingly secularized world, should we abandon our religion in order to advance? My answer, no. Our religion, scripture, and tradition have a lot of insight to offer us if we but take the time to study and reflect upon it. It will be foolhardy to discard all of this root and branch. And the purpose of this class, it is my hope to convince you of the vast but buried riches of our profound Islamic legacy. That's the purpose. That's what I'm trying to do in this class. The real question is, how can we meaningfully engage with our tradition so that we are not inhibited by it, but enriched? And parting thoughts, this is something that I'll leave, I guess, if you get the slides. I ask, have we really stepped into the light, or are we still stuck in jahl? And these are some questions that I ask where I argue that we are still stuck in jahl. I'll put the slides up. Many people have asked me, okay, you forced my hand, I'll put the slides up. So this is further reading that I recommend. You got Asma Afsar-Din's book, The First Muslims, in the top left. And I know I have a lot of questions. I'm going to get to them right after this. I think that's a great starter book if you wanted to know about Islamic history. That's the first one that I recommend students. The second one is Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. This is a great book if you did want to focus on the topic of jihad. Then there's Fred Donner's book, Muhammad and the Believers. You don't have to take the entire theory and accept it. None of these books you should take and read and just have blinders on and take as wahi, right? These are just different viewpoints that you're getting. Then there's Wilford Cantwell Smith's book on the concept of religion, and he talks about what is the meaning of the word Islam. I put, sorry if you can see it, Ghazali's book on the theological tolerance in Islam. I put this to give you a fair representation of what I will call, honestly, it is an exclusivist view of Islam, but I want you to have a fair representation of it. And I think a balanced viewpoint is the one presented by Sherman Jackson in Faisal at-Tafriqa. And it is translated in English with his commentary. I do recommend you to read Javed Ahmed Ghamdi's book, Islam, A Comprehensive Introduction. You can get that book. It's very thick. I do recommend you looking at it. And if you had questions about Itmam Hujjat, which unfortunately I was unable to get into today, that's a book that I refer you to. Then you have Izutsu's book, Ethical Religious Concepts in the Quran. This is kind of the book that inspires me, as well as Fazlur Rahman's book, which is right next to it. And then there's also Bravman's study, which is a Western scholar of Islam. And then a book, if you wanted to know about that view of who a kafir and what kufr means, according to this inclusivist view, I couldn't recommend enough Lamptey's book in the top and the bottom right, which is Never Wholly Other. She brings in some Muslima theology or feminist theology to bear on it, and I think it's quite a fantastic book. All right, so now we are into questions. Signed words, and you sent me a private message. I appreciate that. Umair, I think kafir is one who denies the truth. And so Umair Arshad writes, I think kafir is one who denies the truth in spite of being convinced that it is the truth. If I am wrong, please correct me. And if I'm right, then can't the kafir definition which you explained, please elaborate your opinion. So there are people who say this, that kafir is the one, because kafir comes from the root to mean to cover up. You know, it was dealt with farmers who were covering up seed. And so it's someone who knows the truth and then covers the truth up. Mr. Ghamidi has expressed this view, if I'm correct. Again, you need to refer to his book yourself. Mr. Ghamidi is of this view. I am sympathetic to this view. The only hesitance that I have of this view is that I find it hard to believe that, you know, if people were truly convinced on all three levels of Iman, it seems hard for me to believe that they would still reject and fight. But there is the story of Iblis, of Satan, who believed in God, at least intellectually, but still did kufr. So I think we can come to some sort of arrangement from there, but I think it's a deep topic. And I refer you, if you want to know my view, I think I refer you to Lamptey's book. The word kufr bari and kafir bari. Okay, so that's Humaira mentioned that point. Thank you so much, Humaira, for that. Mr. Javed Iqbal says, can a kafir be juxtaposed with munafiq before Day of Judgment? I think so, in the sense of, I think munafiqs are display kufr. So I don't think that these are two. Now keep in mind that as the tradition develops, these become reified groups that are distinct from each other. But I think this is part of theology. One thing that I say is, and I'm not the one who said it, Goldziher is the one who said it, but I agree with that statement, is that the Prophet was not a theologian. It's later theologians who are involved in, circumscribe belief, delineate different groups, make sure that this is an algorithm that is, that's a theologian's job. The Quran and the Prophet are doing something, I think, a lot deeper than that. They are trying to instill the right ethics in us, but more importantly, they're trying to impel us to proper action. And I think that's how we should read the Quran, at least how I read it. Danish asks, can a good combination of the reason and revelation resolve today's issues of humankind? I mean, I of course agree with you. And that's kind of the parting question that I left with. I think when we talk about Islamic philosophy in a future lecture, I think that is something that we'll come back to. So thank you for your question. Okay, Umair asked, I think that's the same question. Okay, so you might have asked it in private and public. Slides will be, thank you for your talk. Thank you, Mr. Usmani. Thank you, Hassan uncle. Thank you very much. That's my uncle. I appreciate that. All right. So there we have it. Okay. Any last questions before we go? We're just a couple minutes And Professor Zia, thank you so much for your kind words. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Akbar. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I apologize for blabbing so much. I do want to see if we can somehow make this even more interactive. I will try to get it so that we can get some video next time so that we're actually talking to each other, not just on the chat. Thank you, Yasmin. Ms. Reshma asked, what form did Salat take before Islam? This is, if you wanted to do a dissertation, this would be a great topic to do it on. I don't have the expertise to answer this 100% for you. I know Mr. Ghamidi has done some work on this. Hassan Ilyas, who's his son-in-law, I did ask him for some sources on this. But I don't know if we can know it for sure exactly. We can just have some postulates about what we think about that. Omar, thank you so much. A difference between kafir, okay, and munafiq, okay. So Humaira says difference between kafir known and munafiq unknown. I would say that this is correct in the sense of this is the later tradition is definitely going to say that that's the difference. But I think these are semantic fields. So I think within the semantic field of the munafiq, you do have kufr in that semantic field. But this is just my thinking. Thank you so much for your kind words, Nudra. Thank you, Atif. Okay, Imam Muhammad asks, what if revealed knowledge is in contradiction with acquired knowledge? What to do in that matter? Well, this is obviously, a deep question. We could have write tomes of books on this, but this is something that we're going to tackle in our discussion of Islamic philosophy. Then we're going to talk about Imam Ghazali's rejoinder. Ultimately, though, I don't think we can. I can academically give obviously one answer. I have my own viewpoint. That's my personal viewpoint that is informed by my academic learning. But as we'll see, different groups have different answers to this question. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Imam Muhammad. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming. And again, next time I'm going to try to see if we can get this to be even more interactive, especially since I'll be sending up those YouTube. And I'm going to just put my name for YouTube. So that's my YouTube. I'm not trying to increase my followership. I only have a few videos there, but that's where I'm going to upload them. I have, oh, I'm so sorry. I accidentally typed those out to one person only. Let me do that to everybody. Okay, so here is my email address. Again, please note that it is an underscore. Many people get that wrong. And then my YouTube is there. Feel free to email me comments, questions. I hope to get to them, but definitely give me your feedback. We'll try to improve this as we go forward. Thank you so much, Ramadan Mubarak, and thank you for suffering with me through this talk.
This is also available on our Facebook and YouTube channels of Ghamidi Center.
And please also take a look at the other courses that are going on with Ghamidi Center. There's some amazing classes that are going on. If you speak Urdu, please do go to Ghamidi Saab's class. And there's some English classes by Dr. Zahir, and please do go to them. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
And please make a small donation. So I should have put this slide up, I apologize. Please do make a donation. That would be very much appreciated. And thank you for the team at Ghamidi Center for allowing me to give this talk, for all the resources. I'm sorry for hounding you with my repeated tech jahil nature of I'm very tech jahil, so I apologize.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much.